It's the Potpourri Show. An eclectic smorgasbord of delight, gently seeking to topple the dominoes of complacency. A comforting quarter of an hour, a sort of haggis of knick-knacks to satisfy any snapper-up of unconsidered trifles. Why do people go fishing? You may not be an authority on Hugh Fernley Whittingstall. You may not have a hyphen. You may never understand why people tickle trout or seek to catch carp using floating bread and hiding behind the reeds. So why do people go fishing? Wonder if Shirley Abiker with her zither can enlighten us. It was on the Parlophone label, a 78 RPM record, a long time back.
Little boy fishing off a wooden pier. Come fish, bite fish, swim along here.
How do you communicate with a fish? Drop it a line, I suppose. A mum told her daughter, cook a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you get rid of him for the whole weekend.
Then he go fishing all the livelong day.
However, there is a considerable number of women taking up fly fishing. But why? What's the point? Enthusiasts would argue fishing is relaxing, therapeutic. One can enjoy the solitude, become more aware of nature all around, learn patience and concentration. Fishermen contribute annually to the upkeep of rivers and lakes through the rod licence, for there are a huge number of coarse fishing lakes and rivers in the UK which are purely catch and release. But what's the point? Rivers and natural lakes are stocked with coarse fish such as perch, tench, bream and pike. Private lakes tend to be stocked with mainly carp, roach, rudd and perch. Catches in the sea are mackerel, codling, haddock, pollock, bass, sea bass, herring,
dogfish, catfish, any this or that fish. Please swim by my line.
Maybe you have childhood memories of night fishing for dab or fishing off a pier or along the canal bank. As a kid, I went fishing on the rocks at Molvra on Anglesey and caught a few whiting and myself. A bus ride to Bangor Hospital is bitty to remove the barbed fish hook from my finger. So I'm not fishing for compliments. I won a goldfish at a fair once. Here's an amazing account of a man fishing for souls. A number of years ago, in a Baptist church in Crystal Palace, southern London, the Sunday morning service was closing and a stranger stood up at the back and raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, Pastor, can I share a little testimony?" The pastor looked at his watch and said, "You've got 3 minutes." The man proceeded saying, "I've just moved into this area. I used to live in another part of London. I'm originally from Sydney in Australia. Just a few months back I was visiting some relatives there and I was walking down George Street." You know where George Street is in Sydney. It runs from the business hub out to the rocks of the colonial area. And a strange little white-haired man stepped out of the shop doorway, put a pamphlet in my hand and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, are you going to heaven?" The man said, "I was astounded by those words. Nobody had ever told me that." I thanked him courteously, and all the way on British Airlines back to Heathrow, this puzzled me. I called a friend who lived in the area where I'm now living. Thank God he was a Christian. He led me to Christ. I'm a Christian and I want to fellowship here. Everyone applauded and welcomed him into the fellowship. That same Baptist pastor flew to Adelaide in Australia the next week. 10 days later, in the middle of a 3-day teaching series in a Baptist church in Adelaide, a woman came to him for counselling, and he wanted to establish where she stood with Christ. She said, "I used to live in Sydney. Just a couple of months back, I was visiting friends in Sydney, doing some last-minute shopping down George Street, and a strange little white-haired elderly man stepped out of a shop doorway, offered me a pamphlet and said, 'Excuse me, ma'am, are you saved? If you died tonight, are you going to heaven?' She said, I was disturbed by those words. When I got back to Adelaide, I knew this Baptist church was on the next block from me, and I sought out the pastor, and he led me to Christ. And, sir, I am telling you that I am a Christian." This London pastor was now very puzzled. Twice within a fortnight, he'd heard the same testimony. He then flew to preach in the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Perth. And when his teaching series was over, the senior elder of that church took him out for a meal. He said to the elder, "How did you get saved?" The elder said, "I grew up in this church from the age of 15 through Boys' Brigade. Never made a commitment to Jesus, just hopped on the bandwagon like everyone else, and because of my business ability, grew up to a place of influence. I was on a business outing in Sydney just 3 years ago when an obnoxious, spiteful little man stepped out in a shop doorway, offered me a religious pamphlet, cheap junk, and accosted me with a question. 'Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, are you going to heaven?' He said, I tried to tell him I was a Baptist elder. He wouldn't listen to me. I was seething with anger all the way back on Qantas to Perth. I told my pastor, thinking he would sympathise with me, but my pastor agreed with the little man. He'd been disturbed for years, knowing that I didn't have a relationship with Jesus. My pastor led me to Christ just 3 years ago." Now this London preacher flew back to the UK and was speaking at the Keswick Convention in the Lake District. And he threw in these 3 testimonies. At the close of his teaching session, 4 elderly pastors came up to him and said, "We got saved between 25 and 35 years ago, respectively, through that little man on George Street giving us a tract and asking us those questions." He then flew the following week to a similar Keswick convention in the Caribbean to missionaries and shared the testimonies. At the close of his teaching session, 3 missionaries came up and said, "We got saved between 15 and 25 years ago, respectively, through that little man's testimony and asking us that same question on George Street, Sydney." Coming back to London, he stopped outside Atlanta, Georgia, to speak at a naval chaplains convention. And when his 3 days of revving over 1,000 naval chaplains up on soul winning, the chaplain general took him out for a meal. He asked the general how had he become a Christian. The general said, "Well, it was miraculous. I was a rating on a United States battleship, and I lived a reprobate life. We were doing exercises in the South Pacific, and we docked in Sydney Harbour for repairs. We hit King's Cross with a vengeance. I got blind drunk. I got on the wrong bus and got off in George Street. As I got off the bus, I thought it was a ghost. This elderly, white-haired man jumped in front of me, pushed a pamphlet in my hand and said, 'Sailor, are you saved? If you died tonight, are you going to heaven?' He said, the fear of God hit me immediately. I was shocked sober and ran back to the battleship. I sought out the chaplain, and the chaplain led me to Christ, and I soon began to prepare for the ministry under his guidance. Here I am, in charge of over 1,000 chaplains, and we're bent on soul winning today." That London preacher, 6 months later, flew to do a convention for 5,000 Indian missionaries in a remote corner of northeastern India. And at the end, the Indian missionary in charge, a humble little man, took him to his simple little home for a simple meal. He asked the Indian, "How did you, as a Hindu, come to Christ?" He said, "I was in a very privileged position. I worked for the Indian diplomatic service and travelled the world. I am so glad for the forgiveness of Christ, his blood covering my sin, because I'd be very embarrassed if people found out what I got into." One bout of diplomatic service took me to Sydney, and I was doing some last-minute shopping, parcels of toys and clothing for my children, walking down George Street when this courteous little man stepped out in front of me, offered me a pamphlet and said, "Excuse me, are you saved? If you died tonight, are you going to heaven?" He said, I thanked him very much, but this disturbed me. I got back to my town, I sought out the Hindu priest, and he couldn't help me, but he gave me some advice. He said, just to satisfy your curious mind, nothing else, go and talk to the missionary in the house at the end of the road. That was fatal advice, because that day the missionary led me to Christ. I quit Hinduism immediately and began to study for the ministry. I left the diplomatic service, and here I am, by God's grace, in charge of all these missionaries, and we're winning hundreds of thousands of people to Christ. Well, 8 months later, that Crystal Palace Baptist pastor was ministering in a southern suburb of Sydney. And he said to the Baptist minister, "Do you know an elderly little man who witnesses and hands out tracts on George Street?" "I do. His name is Mr. Gaynor, but I don't think he does it anymore. He's too frail and elderly." The pastor asked to meet him. 2 nights later, they went around to this little apartment and knocked on the door. A tiny, frail little man opened the door. He sat them down and made them some tea. He was so frail, he was slopping tea into the saucer as he shook. As he sat there, this London preacher told him all these accounts over the previous 3 years. This little man sat with tears running down his cheeks. He said, "My story goes like this. I was a rating on an Australian warship, and I lived a reprobate life, and in a crisis I really hit the wall, and one of my colleagues, whom I gave literal hell to, was there to help me. He led me to Jesus, and the change in my life was night to day in 24 hours. I was so grateful to God. I promised God that I would share Jesus in a simple witness with at least 10 people a day as God gave me strength. Sometimes I was ill and I couldn't do it, but I made up for it other times. I wasn't paranoid about it. I've done this for over 40 years, and in my retirement years, the best place was on George Street. There were hundreds of people. I got lots of rejection, but a lot of people courteously took the tract. In 40 years of doing this, I have never heard of one single person coming to Jesus until today. Mr. Gaynor died 2 weeks later. Mr. Gaynor spoke to 10 people a day, 3,650 people a year. This simple little non-charismatic, non-Pentecostal Baptist man influenced 146,100 people over 40 years. He has not heard of one person coming to Christ over that time. Can you imagine the reward he went home to in heaven? Nobody except a little group of Baptists in southern Sydney knew about Mr. Gaynor, but his name was famous in heaven. The Potpourri Show. A miscellaneous collection, a combination of incongruous things, a mélange, a ragbag, omnium gatherum, an amalgam of things. Until next time, it's Derek Lindley wishing you every blessing and thanks for listening.